"Are you my mother?" the millionaire rancher's son asked the abandoned mail-order bride. The Silver Creek station was a splinter of wood in a god-forsaken sea of dust. The air tasted of desolation, raw heat, and a crushing, silent loneliness. Esther Sinclair stepped from the train, her worn suitcase her only anchor in this vast emptiness. She scanned the platform, the welcome sign she'd prayed for, just a mirage in her weary mind. This journey had been her one shot in the dark, a desperate flight from a world of cold and hunger, all for the promise of a husband and a home. But the platform was bare. He wasn't here. Panic, cold and sharp, coiled in her gut. She was an outsider, a ghost, before she'd even had a chance to live. Then a sound cut through the silence. A child's giggle. A small boy, his face streaked with mud and sunshine, stepped forward. He looked up at the strange, beautiful woman who smelled of faraway snow and soap, and asked the one question that would shatter her world and rebuild it all at once. "Are you my mother?" The world bled out in shades of rust and bleached bone. From the train window it had been a blur of brutal beauty, but on the Silver Creek platform the heat was a physical presence, a weight on the shoulders. The sun was a hammer beating the silence into the warped planks of the station. Esther Sinclair stood very still, her worn suitcase held tight in a white-knuckled grip. This was the place from the letters. The place where her old life, a thing of gray skies and damp chill, was meant to end and a new one was to begin. She breathed in. The air was a cocktail of coal smoke, hot dust, and a dry herbal scent she couldn't name, the very perfume of desolation. He was not here. The thought, small and cold, landed in the center of her mind. Mr. Robert Montague, the man of honest intentions and a neat, hopeful signature, was not here. The platform was empty. The world was empty. All of the meticulously rehearsed greetings, the gentle smiles she had practiced in the cracked mirror of the train car, dissolved into the shimmering air. Panic began its slow, icy crawl up her spine. This was it, then. The final stop. A fool's errand to a land that had no use for her. Just as the silence threatened to swallow her whole, a sound broke through. A single bright note of life in the stillness. A child's laugh. He came around a stack of sun-bleached crates, a small apparition of gold and brown. His hair was the color of wheat, his face a masterpiece of mud, his eyes a startling clear blue. He stopped a few feet away, head cocked, studying her as if she were a strange bird that had fallen from the sky. Esther's breath caught in her throat. He couldn't be more than 5. Alone. He took a shuffling step forward. "You came on the train." He stated, his voice a soft, high whisper. She could only nod her throat, too tight for words. "Papa said you would—" The boy continued, his gaze unwavering. He took another step closer now, close enough for her to see the dusting of freckles across his nose. He looked down at his own scuffed boots, then back up at her. His small face, a portrait of solemnity. "Are you my mother?" The world tilted on its axis. Of all the fears that had haunted her crossing storms at seasickness, the leering eyes of strange men, this quiet, impossible question was the one thing for which she was utterly unprepared. "My mother. I am no one's mother." "No child." She managed her voice, a reedy thing she barely recognized. "My name is Esther." "I'm Samuel," he replied, as if that explained everything. He pointed a grubby finger down a long red road. "Papa's at the house. He said he was getting me a new one." A new one. The words were so innocent, yet they landed like a stone. She was not a person, not a bride. She was a replacement part, a solution, a new mother to be fetched from the train. And this was her escort, this small, lonely boy. A wave of pity for him, for herself, washed over her, extinguishing the panic. She offered her hand. "Well, Samuel," she said, her voice finding a steadier, warmer tone. "It would not do to keep your papa waiting." He took her hand without hesitation. His was small and warm, a startling anchor in her sea of uncertainty. The road he led her down was a ribbon of red clay cutting through an ocean of white. Cotton fields, vast and silent, stretched to the horizon on either side. The scale of it was breathtaking, a silent testament to a life of anything but simple means. This was a kingdom. The gate was a formidable wall of timber, and beyond it stood a house that was less a home and more a fortress of prosperity flanked by barns and corrals. A man stood on the porch, tall, broad. The Winchester rifle he held seemed less a tool and more a part of him. As they approached, he descended the steps, his boots making no sound in the thick dust. He was Robert Montague. The lines on his face told a story of sun and struggle, but his eyes held a deeper, more profound exhaustion. He looked at Esther, his gaze sweeping over her in assessment. It was not unkind, but it was not warm. It was the look a man gives a horse he is considering buying. "Miss Sinclair," he said. His voice was a low baritone, the sound of rocks grinding together. "You've arrived." "Mr. Montague," she replied, forcing a polite incline of her head. "Your son was kind enough to show me the way." Robert's gaze fell to Samuel, and for a fleeting instant the hardness in his face softened. "He should not have been at the station alone. That is my failing." He looked back at her. "I trust the journey was adequate." "It was long, sir." A heavy silence fell, broken only by Samuel, who tugged at Esther's sleeve. "Is she staying, Papa? Is she our new mother now?" Robert's eyes met Esther's, and the raw, unvarnished truth of their arrangement was laid bare. "Let us be clear," he said, his voice flat, devoid of sentiment. "My son needs a mother. This land needs a mistress. I am providing you with a home and a name. In return, you will care for this house and for the boy." He paused, the silence stretching. "Affection is not a requirement of the contract, but kindness to my son is." Esther stood before him, the dust of her long journey settling upon her like a shroud. She had sought a home and had found a position. She had hoped for a husband and had found an employer. She looked at the great house, at the endless fields, at the sad, guarded man before her. She had escaped a world of hunger, only to find herself in a place where a different kind of starvation seemed to reign. The door to the house creaked open behind him, a dark, waiting mouth. Had she just walked into a sanctuary or a gilded cage? The Montague house was a creature of shadows and polished silence. In the mornings, light streamed through the tall, solemn windows, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air like tiny captive stars. It was a beautiful light, but it carried no warmth. It only served to highlight the profound emptiness of the grand rooms. The furniture was heavy, dark wood, smelling of beeswax and thyme. Every table was flawlessly polished, every rug perfectly placed. It was a house tended with meticulous care but devoid of life's gentle clutter. It was a museum of a life that was no longer lived. Esther learned the rhythms of this silent kingdom quickly. It was a life of quiet duties. She rose before the sun, ensuring the coffee was brewed to the bitter strength Robert favored. She managed the kitchen staff with a quiet efficiency that surprised them and surprised herself even more. She learned the weight of the household keys, the particular creak of the third step on the grand staircase, the way the wind whispered through the eaves in the lonely hours after midnight. She was Mrs. Montague, a title that felt like a costume she had not yet grown into. Her true purpose, her only source of real warmth, was Samuel. He was the sun in this cold, orderly universe. He followed her like a small shadow, his constant chatter a welcome rebellion against the house's oppressive hush. They spent their afternoons in the shade of the great oak behind the house. She would read to him from one of her few worn books, her voice stumbling over the English words, his small finger tracing the strange letters. Read it again. He would demand his head resting in her lap. The part about the Snow Queen. But Samuel, we have read it 3 times. I like it, he'd say simply. It sounds like you. The comment, so innocent, would send a pang through her heart. A queen of a cold, silent castle. The boy saw more than she knew. She would mend the endless rips in his trousers, her needle and thread moving with a skill learned in a world where nothing was ever thrown away. She would listen to his rambling stories about lizards and horned toads. In these moments she was not Mrs. Montague, the contractual bride. She was simply Esther, and he was Samuel. And it was enough. Dinners were another matter entirely. They were rituals of silence performed at a long, formidable dining table that could have seated 20. Robert would sit at one end, Esther at the other, with Samuel, a small, lonely island between them. The only sounds were the clinking of silverware against porcelain and Robert's formal clipped questions. "The inventory for the pantry has been completed," he asked one evening, his eyes on his plate. "Yes, Mr. Montague. I have given the list to cook." "Good." A silence. A chasm. Samuel kicked his feet beneath the table. "I saw a hawk today, Papa." The boy offered his voice small in the cavernous room. Robert's eyes lifted, and for a moment a flicker of something soft crossed his features. "Did you, son, a big one? Bigger than the porch?" Robert offered a tight, fleeting smile, and then it was gone, the mask of the stoic landowner settling back into place. He would look at Esther, then a polite, dismissive nod, before his attention returned to his food. She was a witness to his fatherhood, but not a partner in it. She felt the ghost of the first Mrs. Montague at this table constantly. Her portrait hung in the main hall, a beautiful, smiling woman with eyes full of a life that Esther could not imagine ever inhabiting. Esther was the caretaker of the frame, but the portrait's soul still owned the house. One sweltering afternoon, a storm rolled in, sudden and violent. The sky turned a bruised purple, and the rain came down in hard driving sheets. Samuel, who had been playing outside, ran in soaked and shivering. By nightfall, the shivering had turned into a fever. Esther found him in his bed, his small body radiating a frightening heat, his breathing shallow. A raw, primal fear seized her, the same helpless terror she remembered from her village when sickness came. But then another instinct took over. She was brewing a simple tea of chamomile and mint in the kitchen when Robert stormed in his face, pale with alarm. "Cook said he has a fever," he said, his voice sharp with a panic he could not conceal. "I'll send a rider for the doctor in town. The roads will be impassable until morning. Mr. Montague?" Esther said calmly, her hand steady as she strained the hot liquid. "Let me try something first." He looked ready to argue, his fear making him rigid. He loomed in the doorway, a giant frozen by a memory. She saw it in his eyes. He was not seeing Samuel's fever. He was seeing another, more final one. She walked past him carrying the steaming cup. "Please," she said softly. "Trust me." She sat by Samuel's bed for hours, coaxing the warm tea past his lips, placing cool, damp cloths on his forehead. She didn't pray. Instead, she hummed. A low, wordless lullaby from her homeland, a song her own mother had sung to her. It was a melody of rolling hills and deep, quiet forests, a sound that felt profoundly out of place in the stark, angular house. Robert stood in the doorway watching. He did not speak. He just watched her, this strange woman from a world away. As she sat vigil, her quiet humming a soft shield against the raging storm outside and the storm of fever within. Sometime before dawn, the fever broke. Samuel's breathing deepened and a light sheen of sweat cooled his skin. He was sleeping peacefully. Esther, exhausted, finally leaned her head back in the chair. She opened her eyes to find Robert standing beside her. He was holding a heavy wool blanket. "He's resting," Robert said. It was not a question. "His fever is gone." Robert looked at his sleeping son, then at her. The rigid lines of his face seemed to have softened. "That song you were humming. It is just a song for sleeping children," she whispered. He placed the blanket gently over her shoulders. His calloused fingers brushed her neck for a fraction of a second, a touch so light it was like the ghost of a feeling. It sent a jolt through her entire body. His mother, she never knew how to soothe his fevers. He said, his voice a low, rough murmur. It was the first time he had ever mentioned his late wife to her in anything but the past tense. It was a confession, a crack in the armor. "Thank you, Esther." He said her name. Not the formal title, but her name. He turned and left the room, leaving her wrapped in the heavy blanket, the scent of him of earth leather, and a deep, buried sorrow lingering in the quiet air. A root of hope had found a crack in the barren soil. But Esther knew the West, and new growth always attracts a shadow. A fragile peace had settled over the Montague plantation. It was a quiet thing, as delicate as the morning mist that softened the edges of the cotton fields. It lived in the small unspoken moments that had begun to stitch their days together. It was in the way Robert's eyes would follow Esther as she taught Samuel a simple folk song from her homeland, a brief, unguarded look that held something other than duty. It was in the way she now knew exactly how he took his coffee, placing the cup by his hand without a word. It was in the shared weary sigh at the end of a long day, a silent acknowledgement of a burden jointly carried. The house was still a kingdom of shadows, but now a candle had been lit. Esther found herself walking the fields in the late afternoons, the white bowls soft as clouds against her fingertips. She was learning the language of the land, its moods and its needs. This vast, silent place was no longer a cage. It was beginning to feel like a responsibility, a future, a home. She was watching Samuel chase a grasshopper near the main gate one afternoon when the carriage appeared. It was not a farmer's buckboard or a dusty mail coach. It was a sleek black carriage pulled by two perfectly matched gray horses, and it moved down the red road with an unnatural smoothness, a slash of dark ink across a rustic painting. It was a thing of the city, a thing of wealth and power, and it felt deeply, fundamentally wrong. The carriage stopped, and a man stepped out. He was dressed in a tailored Eastern suit of fine gray wool, a silver watch chain glinting at his vest. He moved with a languid, predatory grace, his polished boots immaculate despite the dust. He was handsome, with a charming smile that did not reach his cold, calculating eyes. Esther instinctively pulled Samuel closer to her side. Robert emerged from the main barn, wiping his hands on a rag. He saw the carriage, and his body went still, his posture shifting from that of a farmer to that of a sentinel. "Montague," the man said, his voice as smooth and cool as riverstone. "Sterling Vance. I've been hearing whispers of your little empire all the way from the capital. I had to see it for myself." "Vance?" Robert replied, his tone flat. He did not offer a handshake. Whispers travel far. The polite, empty dance of powerful men. But beneath it, an undercurrent. A territorial dispute between two kings, one of the soil, one of silver. That evening, Vance was invited to dinner. It was a tense, brittle affair. He charmed, he flattered, he spoke of progress and the future of railroads and capital. His words were a veneer, glossing over the raw, hungry ambition Esther could feel emanating from him. "This is a remarkable achievement, Montague," Vance said, swirling the brandy in his glass. "But it is isolated. One man against the elements. A harsh way to live." "We manage," Robert said, his jaw tight. "Indeed. But imagine more." Vance leaned forward, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial purr. "Imagine a partnership. A consolidated valley run with modern efficiency. My capital, your land. Or, to be blunt, I will buy it from you. A generous price, of course. Enough to set you and the boy up for life anywhere you choose, free from the dust and the toil." The offer hung in the air, glittering and venomous. Esther watched Robert. His face was granite. She knew what this land meant to him. It was not just cotton and dirt. It was his wife's grave, his son's birthright, the very map of his soul. This land, Robert said, his voice dangerously quiet, is not for sale. The silence that followed was absolute. Vance's charming smile did not falter, but something in his eyes shifted. The polite mask slipped for a fraction of a second, revealing the cold reptilian predator beneath. "A pity," he said softly, placing his glass down with a delicate click. "I find that in the West, Mr. Montague, everything has a price. Progress has a way of clearing its own path." The threat was delivered. A gentleman's curse. Sterling Vance left the next morning, leaving behind a trail of expensive cologne and unspoken menace. For a week, the fragile peace seemed to hold. Then the accidents began. It started small. A section of fence along the northern pasture was found trampled, the posts snapped clean. 20 head of cattle wandered off before they were found miles away, scattered and lean. Robert cursed the wildness of the land. A few days later, the pump for the main irrigation channel seized. When Robert's foreman took it apart, he found it choked with gravel poured deliberately into the gears. "Kids, likely," the foreman grumbled, but his eyes were uneasy. Esther said nothing, but she watched. She saw the new tension in Robert's shoulders, the way his gaze now constantly scanned the horizon. She felt the change. The peace was gone, replaced by a low, humming anxiety. The land no longer felt like a sanctuary. It felt like a battleground. She found Robert in the barn late one night, working by lantern light, his face a grim mask of fury. "What is it?" she asked softly from the doorway. He held up a length of leather. "A saddle cinch. It was cut halfway through. My foreman took a bad fall this morning. It was no accident." "It's him!" Esther whispered, the words escaping before she could stop them. "It's Vance." Robert slammed a fist against a wooden post, the sound echoing in the cavernous barn. "I have no proof, just bad luck and broken things. He's too clever to get his own hands dirty." He turned to her, his eyes blazing with a frustrated rage she had never seen before. "He's trying to bleed me out little by little, make me desperate enough to sell." He was looking at her not as a housekeeper but as an ally. He was sharing the weight of his fear. "We will not break," Esther said, her voice filled with a quiet, fierce certainty that surprised them both. "This is our home." He stared at her, the rage in his eyes softening into a dawning respect. She had said, "our." In that moment, standing in the lantern-lit barn, surrounded by the scent of hay and looming danger, they were no longer just two people bound by a contract. They were a fortress of two waiting for a siege. The shadow from Silver Valley had a name, and it now lay over everything they held dear. The question was no longer if Sterling Vance would strike again, but when and how they would possibly survive it. The world had shrunk. Its borders were now the fences of the Montague plantation, its sky the vast watchful canopy overhead. The fragile peace they had cultivated was gone, replaced by the tense, humming silence of a fortress under siege. Every sunrise brought with it a fresh wave of anxiety. Every sunset felt like a temporary reprieve before a long, dark night of waiting. The beauty of the place, once a source of quiet wonder for Esther, was now tainted with a sharp, metallic taste of fear. The sweeping cotton fields looked like a place to get lost. The grand house felt like a cage, a very beautiful, very fragile cage. Robert had changed. The distant brooding man was gone, replaced by a storm cloud of contained fury. He rode the property lines from dawn until dusk, his Winchester no longer resting in his arm but held ready in his hands. His trust in the world, already a scarce commodity, had evaporated completely. His trust in her, however, had begun to take root. They spoke now, not in the stilted formal pronouncements over the dinner table, but in hushed, urgent tones late at night in his study, a room she had never entered before. It smelled of old leather ink and his quiet despair. They were no longer Mr. and Mrs. Montague. They were Robert and Esther, co-conspirators, allies. "He's trying to strangle us without ever throwing a punch," Robert said one night, his large frame hunched over a map of the valley, his finger tracing their property line. He was in town today. "What happened?" Esther asked, her hands wrapped around a cold cup of tea. "Poison," he growled. "He's pouring poison into the town's ear. Buying drinks at the saloon, talking about how the drought has hit me hard, how my credit is overextended. Spreading lies that I'm one bad harvest away from ruin." He looked up at her, his eyes hollow with a weariness that went bone deep. "He's isolating us, Esther. Making it so when he finally makes his move, no one will be willing to help." The insidious genius of it chilled her. Sterling Vance was not a common brute. He was a serpent coiling his way around them, squeezing the life out of their world one subtle constriction at a time. He came to the gate the following week. Esther had taken Samuel outside to fly a kite they had fashioned from newspaper and twine. Robert and his foreman were in the far fields. She saw the sleek black carriage approaching, and her blood ran cold. She pulled Samuel behind her skirts, her body a shield. Vance did not step out. He simply leaned his head from the window, a perfectly pleasant smile on his handsome face. "Mrs. Montague," he called out, his voice carrying easily on the still air. "A lovely day. I do hope you're enjoying our rustic paradise." The word "our" was a deliberate, calculated barb. "This is private property, Mr. Vance," Esther said, her voice shaking only slightly. "Ah, but property is such a fluid concept out here." He mused, his gaze drifting from her to the kite, then to Samuel, who peeked out from behind her. "A woman of your obvious refinement must find this all very trying. A stubborn husband, a land that fights back constantly. There are easier lives to be had, you know." He was talking to her, but his eyes were on the boy. "It would be a tragedy," Vance continued, his voice dropping to a silken thread, "if something were to happen to the future of the plantation. So easy for a child to get lost in these vast fields. So many accidents waiting to happen." He tipped his hat and the carriage rolled away, leaving Esther trembling not with fear for herself, but with a white-hot primal rage that was entirely new to her. He had threatened her child. He may not have been her son by blood, but in that moment, he was hers by every definition of the heart. That night, she told Robert. She watched as his face went from grim resolve to stark, murderous fury. He did not speak for a long time. He simply stood by the window, staring out into the darkness where a monster lurked. The lamp cast his shadow huge and distorted against the wall. He finally turned, and the space between them was charged with a new, raw intimacy. The pretense of their contract, of their arrangement, was burned away by the heat of Vance's threat. "He stood on my land," Robert said, his voice a ragged whisper of disbelief and rage. "He stood on my land and threatened my son. He thinks Samuel is your weakness," Esther replied, stepping closer. "He thinks that by terrorizing the boy and me, he can break you." Robert looked at her, then truly looked at her, and a profound, aching realization dawned in his eyes. "He is wrong," he said, his voice cracking with an emotion she had never heard from him before. He took a step forward, closing the distance between them, and reached out his hand, covering hers. His touch was rough and calloused, but it was incredibly gentle. "You are not my weakness, Esther." The simple touch was a covenant, a promise. It was more real than the marriage license filed away in a dusty town office. In that shared moment of fear and defiance, the silent, grieving king of the cotton fields and the lonely mail-order bride from a world away finally, truly saw each other. They were a family, and their home was under attack. They stood together for a long time, his hand over hers, a silent vow passing between them. They were no longer just defending. They were preparing to fight back. The time for enduring was over. Sterling Vance had made a fatal error. He had threatened not just a man's land, but a mother's child. And for that, he would reap a whirlwind. The harvest moon rose, fat and orange, a nervous eye in the bruised twilight sky. The air, thick with the sweet dry scent of cut cotton, was electric with a tension that had been building for weeks. They were living on a fault line waiting for the earth to break. Every snap of a twig, every hoot of a distant owl was the sound of a threat. Robert had armed the foreman. Esther had mapped every shadow and hiding place around the main house. Samuel was not allowed to wander. They were ready. Or so they thought. The first sign was not a sound, but a light. A sudden hungry orange bloom against the deep violet of the horizon, painting the underside of the clouds in apocalyptic hues. Fire. It erupted in the western fields, the driest section the furthest from the creek. A wall of flame roared to life, devouring a season's worth of back-breaking labor in a matter of seconds. Chaos was instant. Shouts tore through the evening quiet. Men ran from the bunkhouse, their faces stark with panic in the flickering hellish light. Robert was already moving, his voice a roar that cut through the pandemonium. The well. Get the water wagon, form a line at the creek now. Move. He was a general in the face of an invasion, his every instinct focused on the fire that threatened to consume his legacy. He galloped away on his horse, a silhouette of furious determination against a backdrop of flame. He was gone. The house was exposed, just as Vance had planned. Esther's heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic drumbeat against the roar of the blaze. She grabbed Samuel, her hands firm on his small shoulders. This was not panic. This was instinct. This was the moment she had been rehearsing in the dark corridors of her mind every night. "Samuel," she said, her voice a low, urgent whisper that sliced through his fear. "We are going to play a game now. The quietest game you have ever played. You must not make a sound until I say so. Do you understand?" He nodded, his wide, terrified eyes fixed on her face, trusting her completely. She led him not to his room, but to the deep, musty root cellar, its entrance hidden beneath a heavy rug in the pantry. As she lowered him into the cool darkness, she heard it. The crunch of a boot on the porch steps. A sound that did not belong to the fire. They were here. "Stay here," she commanded in a whisper, handing him a small, unlit lantern. "Do not move. Do not make a sound." She closed the heavy wooden door over his head, plunging him into darkness, and slid the rug back into place, just as the back door of the kitchen creaked open. She flattened herself in the shadows of the pantry, her world shrinking to the sound of her own ragged breathing and the soft, menacing tread of two men entering the house. "He's with the fire," a rough voice growled. Vance was right. "Grab the boy and let's be done with it." "Upstairs," said the other. Esther knew she had seconds. Robert thought the battle was in the fields. He had to know he was wrong. She needed to make a sound, a loud one, a sound of chaos that would carry over the roar of the flames. Her eyes darted around the pantry, landing on a precarious stack of her predecessor's heavy cast-iron pots on a high shelf. As the men's footsteps headed for the main staircase, she grabbed the end of a long broom handle, reached up into the darkness, and shoved. The crash was monumental. A deafening metallic cataclysm of iron-striking stone floor echoing through the house like a thunderclap. It worked. The footsteps upstairs stopped. One of the men cursed. But more importantly, she heard another sound from outside. A horse galloping hard, not toward the fire, but toward the house. Robert. He had heard. He knew. The two thugs came clattering back down the stairs in confusion just as Robert burst through the front door. He was no longer a farmer. He was a force of nature, his face a mask of terrible rage, the long barrel of his Winchester glinting in the fiery light from the windows. The world dissolved into brutal close-quarters violence. A shot exploded, deafening, in the enclosed space. One of the men screamed and crumpled, clutching his leg. The other lunged at Robert, and they crashed into the heavy dining table. But the first man, wounded and desperate, was crawling toward the staircase toward Samuel's room. Esther moved. She flew from the pantry, grabbing a heavy water pitcher from a sideboard, and brought it down with all her strength on the man's back. He roared and collapsed. Suddenly, a voice screamed from the darkness of the root cellar. "Papa, behind you!" Robert, locked in a desperate struggle with the second man, spun around. The wounded thug had managed to pull a pistol, but Samuel's cry gave Robert the split second he needed. He shoved his opponent away and brought the butt of his rifle around in a vicious arc, striking the man's hand. The pistol clattered to the floor. The fight was over. The immediate danger had passed. Silence descended, broken only by the groans of the intruders and the crackle of the distant, dying fire. Robert stood in the center of the ruined room chest, heaving his knuckles bloody. He looked at the two subdued men, then at Esther standing fierce and trembling, the broken pitcher still in her hand. His gaze was one of pure, unadulterated awe. He crossed the room in 2 strides and pulled her into a fierce, desperate embrace, his arms a circle of iron around her. He held her as if he might never let go. He then knelt, pulling a sobbing, triumphant Samuel from the cellar, and enveloped them both, crushing them together. A father, a mother, and a child, forged into a single, unbreakable unit in the crucible of fire and ash. The contract was burned away. All that was left was this raw, fierce, desperate love. Dawn broke not with the fury of the previous night, but with a soft, forgiving light. It crept over the horizon, illuminating a world that had been irrevocably changed. The air smelled of smoke and damp earth, a strangely clean scent of survival. The fire was out. The immediate threat was gone. Vance's men, bound and humbled, had been taken away by the grim-faced sheriff before sunrise. The valley was quiet. Wounded, but quiet. Esther stood on the porch, a heavy blanket Robert had wrapped around her shoulders, still holding the faint scent of him. She watched the morning light touch the fields. A vast section was now a black, desolate scar upon the land. But beyond it, acres and acres of white bowls remained untouched, glowing like a promise in the new day. They had lost much, but they had not lost everything. Behind her, she heard the soft scuff of boots. Robert came to stand beside her, a chipped mug of coffee in his hand. He didn't speak, just stood there sharing the silence, his presence a solid, comforting weight beside her. Samuel was asleep inside, tucked into his bed safe. The word echoed in Esther's mind. Safe. "The sheriff believes he's long gone," Robert finally said, his voice low and weary. "Vance won't be back. His name is poison in this valley now." The external war was over. All that remained was the quiet territory of the heart. Esther turned to look at him, at this man she had married by mail. This man she had fought beside. The hard lines of his face seemed softer in the dawn light, the shadows in his eyes finally at peace. "Robert," she began, her voice barely a whisper, "the letter you wrote?" He turned to face her fully, his gaze direct and stripped of all its former defenses. "The letter was written by a fool," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "A broken man who thought a home could be built like a barn with contracts and transactions. I asked for a caretaker, a mother for my son." He took a step closer, his tall frame blocking out the rising sun. He gently took the coffee mug from her unresisting hands and set it on the railing. He took both of her hands in his. "I was wrong," he said, his thumb stroking the backs of her hands. "I didn't know I was asking for a heart. For the heart of this house, the heart of my life." His voice cracked. "The contract is Ash Esther, along with that field. What I'm asking for now, what I should have asked for from the beginning, is a wife, my wife, if you will still have me." Tears she didn't know she was holding spilled over, tracing clean paths through the soot on her cheeks. She could not speak. She could only nod a small convulsive movement. A lifetime of hope, of fear, of longing, culminating in this single, silent affirmation. He lowered his head and kissed her. It was not a kiss of frantic passion, but of profound, grateful tenderness. It tasted of coffee and smoke and the promise of 1,000 quiet mornings just like this one. That evening, the world was reborn in peace. The three of them sat on the porch as the sun bled into the horizon. Samuel, exhausted from the night's terror and excitement, was fast asleep, his head resting in Esther's lap. His small body was a warm, trusting weight. Robert sat on the step below her, leaning his head back against her knees, his gaze fixed on the stars beginning to prick the velvet darkness. He reached up his large calloused hand, covering hers where it rested on Samuel's back. A perfect, unbroken circle of touch. Esther looked down at the dark head of the man resting against her and the bright wheat-colored hair of the child sleeping in her arms. She had crossed an ocean, seeking refuge, and had found it here not in the grand house or the endless fields, but in this small, fiercely protected space. The fire had taken part of the harvest, but in its place something far more precious had finally been allowed to bloom.